themselves. Okay, hopefully that works. Okay, sorry. So I wanted to give a little bit of context to IARPC, because I know when I was new to IARPC, I found it kind of a little bit of an intimidating space. I didn't really know what exactly it was and what it was designed for. I'm probably not the best person to be talking about this, so maybe I can ask my other IARPC colleagues to jump in. But essentially IARPC is it's kind of a coordinating body for Arctic researchers, federal employees. At first it was designed to kind of coordinate across federal agencies who are working in the Arctic space. The thing that's been really wonderful recently is that IARPC has opened up so everyone can participate. So I would really encourage, we're really looking for more participation from people outside of federal agencies. And Meredith and Jessica and Sarah and Kelly have all worked really hard to create a really good website where we can share information and share knowledge, where we can kind of comment on different ideas that are flying around. And we have webinars like this where we can kind of share information too. So I think this was John's idea, my co-lead on the Coastal Resilience team. I know Washington, D.C. is not a cheap place for people to come and visit, and it can be kind of restrictive to be able to come to a meeting in person. So in addition to the kind of webinars that Search set up for the meeting, which was awesome, which I popped in the recordings for the YouTube if you wanted to go back and watch those too. We thought it would be good to kind of have a kind of readout of the meeting and also kind of just get people's thoughts on how they thought it went and what we can do next. I do want to give a quick plug for the Coastal Resilience team that I co-lead. The Coastal Resilience team, I think, would be explanatory. We are interested in all things coastal resilience, and because it's coast, me as a social scientist, I am particularly interested in kind of having more social science, more Indigenous knowledge holders engaged in that conversation. I think our team has done pretty good in the past, but as many of you know, Carolina Behe, who used to co-lead the team, has had to step away, and so we would love to kind of figure out how to get more engagement on that side. Sandy, did you have anything to add from your perspective as a co-lead on the Arctic Observing team?
Hi, yeah, thanks for that rundown, Colleen. That was really informative about IARPC in general. There are effectively 12 collaboration teams that meet regularly on IARPC. The team that Will and I co-chair is the Observing team. And we focus on the fitness of observing systems. Fit for purpose is one of the things that we spend a lot of time looking at. And we utilize a societal benefit framework often in our discussions that was developed internationally at the SAON level, which is our international organizing body under Arctic Council and the International Arctic Science Committee. And so our interest in participating in this call was both to join in the readout of Arctic Futures and also to see how it might inform our discussions about benefit-driven observing systems.
Thanks, Sandy. The IARPC Secretariat, did I miss anything about IARPC that you think should be added before I move into talking about Arctic Futures?
No, you did a great job, Colleen. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I know we kind of have some people who were there to attend Arctic Futures either in person or over the webinar, but I wanted to kind of give a quick rundown for where this kind of meeting came from and what it was supposed to do, just so everyone was on the same page so we could have a discussion about it. One brief kind of disclaimer is that I was not on the conference organizing committee, so I just am kind of talking about kind of from a higher level. But so this conference was designed by Brendan Kelly and the kind of team at Search, which is the study for environmental Arctic change, which has been funded by NSF for some time. And it was really kind of a capstone conference for their report that was for their project that was designed to put scientists, researchers, Indigenous peoples, organizations, knowledge holders, and policymakers in the same giant grand hall of the National Academies of Sciences to discuss kind of what Arctic research and Arctic knowledge production looks like in the year 2050 and how we can better engage policymakers in that discussion. So I also popped a link to the program into the chat too, so you can kind of see some of the topics that were talked about. It was really interesting kind of experiment in terms of a conference. It kind of had an unconventional format in which no one was really kind of giving your classic 15-minute death by PowerPoint conference presentation, but it was more of a panel discussion based on some of the kind of pressing topics that people wanted to discuss in this format. So some of those are implications of changing terrestrial ecosystems. We talked about the Barents Sea. We had a really good panel on Indigenous knowledge approaches to informing policy. The thing that I really appreciated is that the conference organizers had an Indigenous participation working group, which Deenaalee, I believe that you served on, maybe? Okay, there were Nikoosh I know did, and there's those people are listed on the website too. But it was really lovely to see, you know, there were a ton of Indigenous peoples from the Arctic and beyond who were in the audience, and I think they had almost universal representation on all of the panels. I think almost all of the panels. So it was really good to see the diversity of viewpoints to kind of have a really open discussion about some of the things that we should discuss as we're moving towards the production of knowledge for Arctic research and Arctic policy in the coming decades. The other thing that, so we had these kind of panel formats at Arctic Futures, and the audience could submit questions via an app called Slido. And those were really interesting to kind of pop into the panels, so the panelists could answer those questions. They were also really interesting to track during the panels, just kind of see, even if people couldn't get to the questions, kind of what the audience was really, kind of what they were really interested in hearing more about, what they might have, like kind of what the major themes of what the audience was thinking. I did manage to get a copy of all of the questions from Brendan. So I can ask him if he's willing to share them or not. And I can post it on the IARPC website just so everyone can take a look. But it was kind of an interesting way to kind of get feedback from the audience. Instead of having kind of people walk up to a microphone. I think it also helps introverts engage in conferences too, people who might not be you know, willing to step up to a microphone and talk in front of 400 people in this kind of grand hall. One of the other things that I thought was really lovely is that we had a really nice drumming session and dancing in the Hall of the National Academies of Science, which I just thought was like this really lovely way to think about Arctic research and what that all meant. So I think that was my quick readout. I wonder if anybody else had anything to add. And if not, I would love to hear the perspectives from Nikoosh and Deenaalee on what they thought of the meeting. Okay, so Nikoosh and Deenaalee, it seems like I would love to hear from you two.
Deenaalee, do you want to go first or do you want me to start?
I think you should start.
Okay. And just to check really quick, is Rosemary on?
Rosemary, there? It doesn't seem so.
Okay. So I attended the entire conference, and I spent a lot of the conference. I was on the closing panel with two other scientists and Fran Ulmer. And so I spent a lot of the conference kind of listening and taking things in and sort of consolidating things. And I'll just mention some of the things that I mentioned on that closing panel, because I think they're important as we think about sort of ways forward and how we do things differently. I agree with a lot of the things that Colleen mentioned as being positive. The format was a little bit different than maybe a traditional science conference. there was Indigenous participation, as in the forms of the panels, on many panels. And George did some really great drumming and singing during the reception, and that was a good way to open things. He was delayed and didn't arrive. That was something that was going to happen on the first evening, and I think that would have set the tone a little bit differently. So having said all that, there's definitely sort of places that could be done differently and felt a little bit more comfortable. In general, the Indigenous participants felt a little bit unbalanced in both the space and in the content and how things were sort of structured. And that's something I mentioned in my remarks at the end of the meeting. And so, but as a stepping stone, as a point to like move through multiple processes and form stronger relationships, it was a step along that process. So I think that's a positive thing. In sort of looking forward, I think there's opportunities and really a desire potentially from people who were there to look for places where you could build stronger exchanges, where you can have this like really open and honest dialogue and very truthful discussion about what the challenges are in communicating across these three sort of different groups of people, and how to look for ways to maintain really open lines of communication. And some of that need, or something that might help that, is just really spending time and effort in developing like personal relationships in smaller groups, and using that, using a different type of space and a different format to really get to that place where you have strong exchanges of information, and really acknowledging that is really a multi-step process, and this is one of the steps along the way, and there's different ways to do that, but that it would require commitment by everyone involved, and really a lot of work to maintain something like that. Another thing that came up a lot was resources, how resources are generated, how they are distributed, who gets them, who has the power in that sort of resources dynamic. And in terms of me, like kind of looking forward, I spent a lot of time thinking about how we create new sources of funding. How do we draw from different sources, like venture capital, like social impact investing? How do you draw from the resource of things that are probably going to come online in the future if they're not already here, like carbon offset programs, volunteer carbon offset programs, which generate revenue, but how do you feed that stuff like that? Like carbon pricing, which will come online eventually, green banks that fund energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, how you use these revenue streams to, in part, support communities that are facing the impacts from climate change. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, but in general, thinking about how you create new sources of funding and who has the power in directing where those funds go and how communities are supported. Another thing that came up a lot during the conference was how many, and the sort of like diversity and the different types of institutions and governance frameworks are already existing. And whether that's from sort of the university perspective and sort of governance structure, or whether that's tribal government structures, or whether that's an international framework like the Arctic Council, like how these existing frameworks are working for or against a community's resilience, and how we can feed into those structures and be heard as Indigenous people, and how those structures, so one thing I think about going forward is like how those structures can be changed or adjusted so that there is a greater participation from Indigenous peoples, and there's more understanding and more listening to the people that are sort of on the ground locally, and really needing to address the issues of a changing climate. And so going forward, thinking about how do we evolve those institutions to work for us? How do we empower sort of local communities within those different frameworks? I think I mentioned all of those things in my comments at the meeting. Deenaalee, you were on a panel, right? The Indigenous Knowledge panel, and so I'd love to hear about that.
So like Nikoosh said, I was on the Indigenous Knowledge panel, and kind of how that came about was that George ended up having delays due to a changing climate in Alaska, and we were unsure if he was going to be able to make it. And at this point, we only had 3 people that were sitting on the panel. And then Charlene Stern was also not able to make it down due to a death in the family, which is something that we as Indigenous people have to face on a much higher level than a lot of other communities within the United States and abroad, as marginalized people that are dealing with intergenerational trauma. And so I ended up sitting on this panel and gave a speech during my 5 minutes, and I talked about being a commercial fisherwoman, in which I'm a commercial fisherwoman in Bristol Bay, and seeing and observing the impacts of climate change on our fish, particularly in the fish die-offs that were happening due to high temperatures of water in Bristol Bay. I kind of want to pivot from that a little bit and talk about the feedback that I got after giving that presentation. It was profound. I think I got it from scientists, from other people that were present that might not necessarily be part of the science community, a few policymakers that were sprinkled into the room, and by and large, I got huge feedback from youth that were present that also did not feel like their voice was being heard. And these are people that there was not really a high school presence there, but there was definitely young professionals and college-age students that were engaged at Arctic Futures. And both Native and non-Native students came up to me and said, yes, we need to be hearing more of our own voices up on stage. And I think that this is something that IARPIC and Search and our broad Arctic resilience community can be really looking at. We had, how many students were there from Students on Ice? Y'all know?
Maybe 5 or 6.
Yeah, so there was like 5 or 6, and I know that they interacted a little bit with people. However, you know, that was a group of knowledge holders that were present and at Arctic Futures, but I didn't really see them on stage. I didn't really see them interacting very much with people, apart from in the small breakout sessions that we had to get coffee. And these are students that, you know, are usually coming from Indigenous communities across the circumpolar north that had a wide range of experiences to share. And I feel like they weren't really listened to or, you know, brought to the forefront in the way that they could have, because they were some of our only youth that were actually able to make it to Washington, D.C. another thing that I was thinking about while I was there as well was where were our Arctic youth ambassadors? We have a couple different programs that are going on in the Arctic right now, and we can of course create more. And it would be amazing to see other ways of engaging youth within the Arctic and within research themselves. But where were they? And another thing that we talked about within the Indigenous group was where are the policymakers? And I think scientists brought it up as well. If we're trying to bridge this gap and think about how do we translate not just between Indigenous knowledge holders and scientists, we need to also be translating the knowledge systems that we're sharing with each other with policymakers that were not in the room. And that would have been a whole next level conference, but I think we could do it. We could do it. And so where are we willing to really push the dial, and how can we imagine our future together? Because that's really what this conference was about. I think, Nikoosh, you touched on a lot of different topics, and I just wanted to enunciate a little bit more on our Indigenous breakout session, because I found as a young person that, like I said in my introduction, I was interning at the Polar Institute, and was I was the only Native person there, and I was the only young Indigenous person there as well within the Wilson Center. And when we come to spaces, whether it's university like Brown or it's in Washington, D.C., we are at the margins regardless of how vocal we are. And we usually are one of the only people in the room. So creating those spaces, for those of you that weren't there, we ended up having 2 lunch breakout sessions during the second day and the third day. And it was a space where it was only Indigenous people for us to talk about. Oh, there's the youth. For us to talk about how we were feeling, what we needed to decompress on within the conference itself, other issues that we wanted to be raising. And these are vital spaces for us because we have never actually had spaces, especially within a circumpolar situation, where we can be talking about these issues in a very frank and I think unguarded way. And so being able to have unguarded conversations with each other allows us to reflect and to be thinking about what are the best ways to communicate with U.S. scientists or U.S. policymakers as well. And as somebody that is at university and is at and that was in Washington, D.C., I think it's just important to say that we're still grappling with issues around wellness and issues around voice and taking agency back after agency has been stripped away in so many different ways from our communities. I think that's probably where I want to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deenaalee and Nikoosh, for sharing your thoughts. I know it's not easy to try to represent a lot of viewpoints that you're often on the hook to do so in spaces like these. But I really appreciate you coming to this meeting, kind of sharing the perspective from how you experienced the meeting. And we have a couple of minutes for questions. So if anybody else on the call has a question, feel free to pipe in, or you can pop something into the chat. But Deenaalee and Nikoosh, I can open it up. When you were talking, you brought up that we still have a lot of work to do in kind of moving these spaces forward. And we talked about the people who were missing in the room. So one of them was policymakers. There wasn't that many, even though the conference was in Washington, D.C., geared towards policymakers. Deenaalee, you brought up youth, which I think is a really good point, and like kind of tapping into our youth ambassador network. For someone at NSF, I think a lot about the kind of research coordinators on the ground that we could work with too. Someone else is bringing up engineers and how to kind of move kind of basic research into more applied research. So I'm wondering, kind of moving past Arctic Futures, how do we prioritize, or do we need to prioritize, and how do we kind of move this forward when we have so much work to do and lots of different groups that we have to kind of move forward with. And I don't want to just put Deenaalee or Nikoosh on the spot, so this is a question for everybody to chime in.
I think one of the things that I was, that continued to come up for me, mostly because I was offered a mentorship while I was there quite a few times, and in thinking about the role of mentorship within the science community, or even the role of mentorship within our Indigenous communities. You know, we as young people are constantly, we revere our elders, whether they are somebody that is elder to us by 2 years or 20 years or 40 or 60 years. And so how does knowledge get passed down, and how can scientists or policymakers or people that are in the nexus of those places really be bringing young people, or even their peers, along? We are all mentors within our own right, and I think that is a place where we can really be exploring what it means to grow knowledge as collaborators, and not just as top-down institutions as well. Because if and I'm using the word you as a big you, if you take on a young person as a mentor, remembering that they, for example, like if I was coming to a space and being mentored by somebody in Washington, D.C., or being mentored by a scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, I have a whole set of knowledge systems that I was raised with from the village, that I'm coming as that Indigenous knowledge holder. And even though, you know, I might have been in this when I was like 17, that is still a whole set of knowledge it's valid. And so remembering that our voices, regardless of how young or old or gender or race or whatnot, are valid, and how do we really collaborate in order to co-produce, not just for the sake of co-production, but for the sake, or for production within under a capitalist regime, for the sake of creation and creating a new future, really.
Thank you.
So in thinking about steps to move forward, this is one thing that I mentioned at the conference, is thinking about different leaders and organizers for different for future events, or, you know, as a step forward. And that doesn't mean that, you know, people say, okay, now the Indigenous people, for example, could be youth, they're just going to organize they're going to organize something and we're going to attend it, right? It's about supporting them and providing resources and support, and taking sort of a step back and being in that supportive role, not leading, supporting somebody else leading a different process. So that could be like a more Indigenous centered process, or it could be a youth-led process. Reading that. So that's how you sort of, in my mind, that's how you sort of put, support the different perspectives coming together, and creating a different balance between the three different main groups that we're talking about. I don't know, maybe some others who have been thinking about this also have some suggestions, since you opened up the question to everyone.
Yeah, I would love if anybody else wants to pipe in, please feel free.
Yeah. Well, I just like to, I'm interested in the conference, and I listened as much of it as I could, but I'm really more interested in how you translate this to work in the field and work in the villages and work on the ground. I mean, it's fine to come together in DC and have a conference, and it was more balanced than many of the conferences I've been to in the last 40 years. So that was good. But I'm more interested in sort of going forward. How do we translate this out of the conference room and into action, in the field, in the villages? I've heard about co-production of knowledge, and I don't go too far back, but I started working with Indigenous people back in the late 90s. So, I for a little while, but I'm really interested in sort of, what we do going forward beyond sort of talking about it at conferences.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point. I also kind of had a similar reaction to the conference, in which I thought, was really nice to get a diversity of viewpoints, but, to me, it was lacking in kind of what are the action items that we should be moving forward. I wish we might have had, I feel like Nikoosh's kind of summary panel that summarized some of that up helped to move that forward. But yeah, I do think we do need to kind of think about, okay, what are the concrete things that we can do? And I think Nikoosh and Deenaalee have been trying to outline some of those here. But then how can we also, for the federal agencies on the phone, how can we support that, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, this is Jeff with the Department of Transportation. I don't want to be negative, but one of the things that I was a little disappointed with the lack of policymakers myself. And I think part of the perspective here is if you have a conference and you invite people to attend, the people who are interested in that stuff will attend, and the folks who are busy and who maybe aren't interested won't, and they didn't. And the way you reach policymakers, in my opinion, that's code for politicians, is you lobby them. And sending them an invitation is not going to be, I don't think, as effective as cornering people and approaching them directly. And I think Fran kind of hit some of those points too during the wrap up. Just inviting folks who you would like to attend won't work. I deal with that all the time at work.
Yeah, and I was having sort of similar thoughts, reflecting with another colleague who had attended. So what I've heard is, if the Hill won't come to you, which it often won't, you have to go to the Hill. So I was wondering if maybe, obviously this is a one-off conference, but perhaps if there's another large delegation of Indigenous peoples coming to DC, we can go the extra mile and try to set up actual meetings on the Hill to try to get that face-to-face time. Because in my kind of personal experience, it's hard to really understand the extreme changes and the hardships that are kind of being faced by these people unless you see it firsthand. And trying to get policymakers to Alaska has its own issues associated with that. So I don't know if maybe that would be useful to try to set up those meetings. And I understand it's uncomfortable, but trying to get those face-to-face stories across.
We had some of that is a good idea. This is Nikoosh, and I was part of the Indigenous participants working group. And we did have, we had a lunch meeting or breakfast meeting with Murkowski's staff set up. I wasn't there yet. And so that was another problem, was the timing of the conference and it being, asking people to take part of their long week, they'd have to get there even earlier in order to do that. So the timing was difficult, but we did organize some of those types of meetings. And we did have at least one person from each of the Alaska delegation registered for the conference. I saw 2 people there, but I couldn't see everyone. And then I think 3 different committees. The Science Technology Committee, and then there's a Climate Solutions Committee, Climate Crisis Solutions Committee, I think on the House side. They were also there. So there was some. I think one of the other things that we're talking about policymakers, and I'm not sure that was defined really well there at the sort of beginning and outset. And, many of the Indigenous participants, come from communities. We wear multiple hats all the time. And, many of them serve in their tribal governance structures and are actually decision makers and policy makers, even if they, didn't raise their hand when that question was asked. And so I think it's also a function of sort of recognizing that policymakers is a term that's greater than just who is in Congress, right? And so the reach, I think, may have been, there could have been more policymakers involved, but I think there may have been more than we think or thought at the time.
Yeah, Nikoosh, I agree. I was thinking about how they define policymakers too. And from looking at the questions on Slido, it seemed like there were actually more people who probably weren't willing to raise their hands and identify as a policymaker in the audience. So I think they were kind of hiding out, but it would be a good idea to think about kind of how we can better open up lines of communication on some of these issues. But I do want to give Sandy a chance to talk about kind of what this meeting means for some of the things that she and the observing team is working on in terms of what Arctic Futures kind of is helping to influence what they're doing. So Sandy, I'll hand it over to you for now.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm sorry to cut off a fruitful discussion, and I would actually invite people to continue to weigh in on these points as we maybe just shift the frame a little bit towards sort of like Will. I'm interested in understanding what we learned from the conference, how it can inform how we're discussing, planning, and moving forward on structures like observing systems. I would love to learn also, based on this discussion, I think we're recognizing that our mechanisms for convening, hearing voices, learning, mentoring are really an extension of our cultures that we sit in. The science culture, I have often felt, has a pretty limited set of approaches for conferences and meetings. There's always a kind of palpable power structure at these meetings that are often felt by scientists themselves. And so I think we could stand to learn a lot about how to deconstruct and more explicitly see the power structures that are at play as well. And so I would be happy to learn more about different ways of convening and engaging that would deconstruct those a little bit and help us do more that we know we're capable of doing. From the standpoint of observing systems, one of the things that we've been focused on in our observing system team is the broadest topic of environmental security. And as we're trying to wrap our heads around and understand what types of observing systems we should be trying to expand and promote that are really going to support needs in the region, again, we need to have the right people at the table, and we need to have mutual, as Nikoosh said, commitments that we're going to try to find ways to work together on these things, if possible, and I do think it is possible. And so I would just like to open up the floor for comment. And again, this venue, these webinars that we run through IARPIC, another example of one of the ways we came up with to exchange information. But we know it often doesn't work. There's often a lot of quiet people on the phone. People call in, listen for a little bit, and then think, oh, this isn't for me. What can we do, learning from this meeting and these discussions, to improve our process moving forward? So I'll take one cue off of something Nikoosh said. we had you had mentioned smaller discussions, maybe more where there's more time and space to develop mutual understanding, or perhaps more Indigenous leadership within IARPIC collaborations. How might you see something like that being, how might we approach something like that through the IARPIC collaboration space? Or is it just not the right space to think about doing something like that?
Go for it.
Was somebody else going to say something? Was that me? This is Nikoosh.
Deenaalee was going to chime in, but she handed the mic over to you.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm not sure the collaboration space is the right space. So one of the things that I saw and heard from other Indigenous participants is that we weren't, the conference wasn't the right venue to really talk about what some of the issues are, right? And so that's kind of like, we didn't get to that point, and that you would need sort of much smaller, more time, much smaller, and sort of more intimate face-to-face in order to even have those types of conversations. Like, what really is the challenge in our communication? What is a community? What are the community priorities? How do those translate? An understanding of what is challenging for scientists and working in this area, and what is challenging for policymakers. So that's kind of the, smaller groups in person, more time, and from an Indigenous perspective, led more from sort of an open dialogue. We're all sitting here, in a circle, face to face, having a conversation. Deenaalee, do you want to add on here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very iterative process, and we're not, the thing that I keep hearing is like, well, what is the solution? Well, what is the solution? And right now we're in a time where, like, this is all new. We are still working on, like I was talking about before, working through our own colonization and kind of peeling back the layers of that, decolonizing ourselves. And yet at the same time, we need to be asking of the larger public to be working on their histories as well, and to be doing work that we might not be able to always bring to that space. And also understand that, one of the things that we talked about was how we always feel like we, being Indigenous people, have to start with the basics. Say, like, okay, what is ANCSA? Or what is Alaska Native Plant Act? Or what is ANILCA? And teach people very basic issues that were not taught in something like Alaska Native Studies, or are not taught within the university systems. And so we're having to work across multiple levels right now. And I think that's the hard part, is like, we can't continue to silo our issues. We right now have to be calling on everybody to wear multiple hats, like we as Indigenous people have to wear. Like Nikoosh was saying, you have to be a policymaker, you have to be a scientist, you have to be a student and a learner and a teacher as well. And it's going to take a lot of effort. Sandra, you talked a little bit about the power structures that are currently at play, and what does it mean to look at a conference and kind of dissect those power structures that people are normalized to. And so as we go through these processes of continuous collaboration, we're also dismantling those power structures. and and figuring out how to relate to one another, I think, without hegemonic power structures as well. And that is that deep work. And from the social science perspective, you know, I work within Indigenous anthropology, and as an Indigenous anthropologist, I'm trying to unsettle a lot of damage that has been done by Indigenous or by anthropologists that have worked and extracted knowledges from our communities. And so right now, I mean, I could send out an email with so many Indigenous scholars that work within the Western Academy that have disrupted the anthropological framework that would allow people to really be thinking about what settler colonialism is, what co-production is, what community-based research is, and that's where it's like we have to do the work. We all have to do the work. And it's not going to be easy, and we're not going to solve it within one of these phone calls. And and also, you know, we can't continue to tokenize people either. You know, Nikoosh and I aren't going to have all the solutions right now, but we can give resources to say, spend your Sunday and go read Mohawk Interruptus by Audra Simpson. And what can you glean out of that? And maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's having book talks around some of these things so that we can be talking about different power structures that are within research communities, whether it is the STEM sciences or social sciences. The other thing I wanted to touch on real quick is this the proper space? And I think that this is fantastic, but this can only go so far as people, one, being comfortable with each other, as Nikoosh talked about, but also, like, we need help in order to get broadband in our communities in Alaska. We kind of touched on that during the security. It was a panel that was put on by the Wilson Center, and how we were talking, I can't remember who brought it up, but I commented on it. Does anybody remember? It was a panel, and broadband was brought up in Alaska.
Was it the nuclear disaster panel?
Yeah, it was a nuclear
that was the panel. That was the panel.
Oh, you can go in and you can make comments. Well, most of our communities in Alaska, especially like Indigenous rural communities, cannot make a comment because we do not have broadband. And if there is even the slightest amount of 3G or LTE, it's supplied by one company in Alaska, that's GCI, and GCI has a monopoly. So we need to be dismantling those power structures as well, and calling for equity within our technologies too.
Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that one comment from Deenaalee. I think she's right that there's, you know, a real need to develop trust and relationships, and that takes time to really have a successful co-production in these communities. And I think I learned a lot in my work with the North Slope Borough Wildlife Department. I spent about 6 years in Ahtuangaruak and have continued to work up there, but I think that there really could be an interesting case study in how they've succeeded over the years in bridging the gaps between the science community and policymakers. I think there's a lot of successes there that could be drawn on and really would be worth looking at.
I don't know if this would be following on with that, Allison. If IARPIC collaborations could be the space where we maybe host some of those conversations, kind of learn best practices from these co-production spaces, and just learn a little bit more about what has been successful. I think a lot of people found the Canadian example of the marine protected area very inspiring, and we've been talking a lot about this whole government approach within the staff group for IARPIC, and maybe we can find a space to hold those conversations soon, hopefully. Or one day at least.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there needs to, you know, somebody needs to facilitate a conversation about what works, because there are some successes out there, and how do we make more of that happen.
In the meantime, I'm going to take Deenaalee up on a book club for IARPIC.
Yeah, I love that idea.
I think it's a fantastic idea, and I would be happy to play a role in helping to convene that. But let's talk more after this discussion, because that sounds really wonderful to me, and very appropriate to use this space for learning, which is what we're really here to do.
Excellent. Shoot me an email.
Yeah, that was a great comment, Deenaalee. It also made me think of another sort of related to that. There's some great podcasts out there. So All My Relations is one, and that I listen to regularly, and another one is Coffee and Quack. And so those would provide, if you, in one option in, book club might be, is to mix it up a little bit and listen to this podcast, and let's have a discussion about cultural appropriation, or let's have a discussion about Native fashion, or let's have a discussion about what language is, right? And how important it is to conveying culture. So I think you could go a lot of different ways with that. But
you put some of those in the chat, just for food for thought, and
yeah,
this is great.
Yep, I will do that. But so I wanted to emphasize one other thing that Deenaalee mentioned, and that is, one of the things that we're struggling with, wearing multiple hats, sort of working on our own sort of decolonization processes, and then also being asked to educate lots of other people about sort of this system, and what it means to be Indigenous, and sort of how to function in that world. And that's a lot too, and there's a lot of work that can be done. There's a lot of resources out there, and that sort of leads back to the books and other websites and other, but there's solution that can happen that would, I think, would help move things forward too.
I also I'm so excited about this conversation, because I feel like we're getting like concrete things that we can move forward with. I also wanted to put a plug in for the Olivia Lee, Martin Jeffries, Ellen Pope, and I, we run a diversity and inclusion group via IARPIC too, in which we're thinking about kind of how to get better representation in Arctic research and beyond from Indigenous peoples and also from women. And I would say that a couple of us have been brainstorming. For those of you who are not familiar, a lot of the IARPIC priorities are kind of set forth by an Arctic research plan that is written by federal employees. And Meredith and I have kind of started discussions on how to make that a more inclusive and equitable process too. We have some limitations there, but talking about how to kind of be setting priorities at a federal level with more voices involved. So I would encourage you to keep an eye on that. We would love to hear more on your ideas for that too.
And this is Renee. I attended the first 2 days of the meeting, and I had some similar impressions. I also felt like that there has been work that's been done and been successful, and having an opportunity to showcase success stories and learn those lessons and share the positive aspects of things that have happened in the past, like 10 or 15 years that have advanced. We've gotten us to where we are now, which is still a better place than we were, but we do have a long way to go. And also through IARPIC, there have been a few efforts to try to have an ongoing dialogue about things that work well. In the Field Operations Working Group, there's an emphasis on sharing those good practices, on working with communities, engaging with people, whether, Indigenous scholars, whether it's co-production or community-based observing. And even the term good practices, somebody pointed out to me that the term best practices, who decides what is the best? Maybe what seems best to a lot of scientists isn't best for someone who's in a community. And so I'm constantly decolonizing my own brain and thinking, and I do spend, I think many of the folks on this call probably also do spend time and effort trying to improve ourselves all the time. And so just the notion of saying good practices, because we're not judging what's best. It's not always best for everyone, but if it works, it might be good. And IARPC did develop a set of principles for conducting research in the Arctic to set a bar for these kinds of interactions and behaviors, and make sure that we're very explicit on the expectations for researchers who are working in communities. And specifically, I mean, like Western researchers, not Indigenous scholars, clearly bring a lot of expertise with them. And just specifically, there's a principle on respect, and I'm just going to read it to you because there are main principles that are pretty apparent, but the third principle is respect Indigenous knowledge and culture. And the first sub-bullet under there is respect is enhanced by mutual understanding. Researchers are encouraged to learn about the regions in which they will conduct research, understand the region's history, culture, language, community perceptions of past and current research conducted in the research, organizational structures, practices, values, and institutions. We really recognize how important it is to do the work, as you said, and to understand what's gone on before you got there and what impacts that had on people. And so in addition to just kind of focusing on good practices and where can we go from here, you do need to bring in understanding. You need to understand what is ANCSA when you go and work in a community, and how the village structure is set up, the difference between a native corporation and a village corporation, and tribal leadership. And so, just continuing to emphasize those things in our conversations with our colleagues is also really important, and keeping us moving forward on doing the work.
Thanks, Renee. Those were really helpful points. I want to be respectful of people's time. This has been such a good conversation that we're over by 7 minutes already, which is awesome, but I know people are busy and have other meetings to run to. So I just wanted to open up for any final comments from anyone on the call. Any final thoughts about the meetings or some of the things that we brainstormed today? I would love to hear them.
This is Josie. I just wanted to say that I recognize the meeting as an opportunity to actually put into practice a lot of these concepts that we've been talking about decolonizing methodologies, including traditional knowledge in our research and in everything that we do. So I think that was it. That was an opportunity to start something new, and this meeting is also moving us forward in that direction.
Thanks, Josie. Anybody else?
It's been pointed out several times that as Indigenous peoples, you guys wear a lot of different hats, and I just want to thank you for your time and participation today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll second that. Thanks so much for taking the time to provide your thoughts. I learned a lot, and I have a feeling a lot of other people did on the call too. And I thought this call was great, so I really just want to thank everyone for kind of participating in the discussion. And thanks especially to Deenaalee and Nikoosh for being open about kind of how you experienced the conference as well. So I think without anything else, I'll call an end to this meeting. Thanks for staying 10 minutes after our planned time. I thought this was really great, so I'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Kelly, are you capturing everything in the chat?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, it will be captured.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Go get in.
Excellent.
Aloha.
Anamasi.
Hi, Kelly.
Hey, Meredith. That was a really great conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Olivia's suggestion for putting all those podcasts into a post, we should do that.
Definitely.
I
Yeah.
think going to say that the diversity and inclusion group could be a nice host for some of this. I need to run to another meeting, but thanks so much for moving this forward and kind of setting everything up. I thought it went really well. So
Great job, Meredith.
Thanks. You too. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.